Okay, this is the continuation of Chapter 6, Governance and Finance in U.S. Schools. And we talked about the duties of the superintendent on page 184, and it went on to page 185. So now we're going to talk about the role of the parents. I want you to highlight the first two paragraphs on page 185. And really what I want you to know is that parents are very instrumental in public schools, and there are three recognized groups that you certainly heard of: PTA, Parent Teacher Association, maybe it was PTO, Parent Teacher Organization. There's one in the book referred to as Parent Advisory Council, or the PAC, and I believe there's one called Parent Teacher Student Association, PTSA. That's not located in the book. But when parents are involved in the schools, there have been several studies that test scores go up. Um, um, Parents that are involved in school, their students read better. It's just a whole lot of different positives when parents are involved, and very, very few negatives, if any at all. That's pretty much all I want you to know about that. On page 186, school-based management pretty much is that school-based management simply means that instead of having to go and get stuff approved budget-wise, stuff to get approved through the school board, through the superintendent, the principal and the teachers and the parents at a particular school, let's say Bankston Elementary School, if they had school-based management, that would mean that the principal, the teachers, everybody involved, the stakeholders at that particular school, would make the decisions about the budget and how they would spend their money. So that's what school-based management is. Not many schools do that, but you do have a few. I'm going to turn over a couple of pages to page 190. What powers and influence do states have in governing schools? And I want you to look at, as I am talking through this, I want you to also refer to page 191, which is a typical state school system setup. Now, Mississippi is set up like this. We don't have all of these components, but we do have pretty much all of them. And since we're talking about figure 6.4 on page 191, we will talk about the state legislature, the governor, and the state courts. After them coming down, you have the State Board of Education, which we have two. We have one that governs institutions of higher learning, and that's what they're called, IHL. They cover all colleges and universities. And then you have one for K or P12 schools. Then you have what's called a chief state school officer, the commissioner of education. We have a commissioner. His name is Dr. Hank Bounds, and he is over the institutions of higher learning. He's like a superintendent over the colleges and universities. We also have a state superintendent, Dr. Carrie Wright, and she is over the K-12 system or P-12 system, all the public schools in Mississippi. Also Mississippi Math, the School in Science, also Mississippi School for Blind, Mississippi School for Deaf. She would be over all those schools. And the interesting thing, just as a tidbit, because some of you may know this being a Mississippian, but we have many people who are not Mississippians in our class. The first person I referenced, Dr. Hank Bounds, was the state superintendent at one point. In fact, his promotion was to IHL commissioner, and now he is, well, I just said that he was IHL commissioner, but he was the state superintendent at one time. Okay, now coming under that, we have some people that have held the title as deputy this and deputy that, but in this particular outline, they have a deputy commissioner of administration, deputy commissioner himself, the deputy commissioner of special programs. We really don't have that. And go on down to this, well, we have some. I don't know if they exactly hold the deputy title. You have the State Department of Education. Of course, ours is called Mississippi Department of Ed, and under that you have different divisions, as you can see in blue. And I already mentioned some of them. Community college has one, public schools has one, the colleges and universities, the schools for the deaf and the blind have one, and so on and so forth. Even adult education or community education. Then under that you have some intermediate units, your educational service agencies, your local school districts and school boards, and your principals, your teachers, and your students. So that is a typical way that a state school system is set up. And we're going to focus on the legislature first. The legislature, starting on page 190, I want you to highlight quite a bit in this section because I don't think most people realize when they go to vote who they're electing. I think that they go by reputation, name. Sometimes they go by how long a person's been in, but I don't think that many people vote based upon record as far as education wise, because a lot of politicians do not claim education to be their platform. They usually claim other platforms, but whether they claim education to be a platform or not, the legislature, your senators, your representatives have awesome power. They have just a lot of power in determining what goes on in the local school districts. So I want you to, if you don't mind, highlight pretty much the entire section, which is going to take you on to page 191, and it talks about nearly in every state the legislature is responsible for establishing and maintaining public schools and for determining basic educational policies within the state. Now I'm going on to the bullets. Those policies that the state legislature may determine are the following: how the state boards of education will be selected and what their responsibilities will be. So the board that is over the colleges and universities, IHL, the board that's over the State Department of Education at Mississippi Department of Ed, they're determined by the legislatures. How the chief state school officer will be selected and what his or her duties will be. The IHL commissioner, the state superintendent. How the State Department of Education will function, how the state will be divided into local and regional districts, how higher education will be organized and financed, how local boards will be selected and what their powers will be. Because some boards, as we talked about, are elected by the people and some are appointed usually by a mayor. In addition, the legislature may determine how taxes will be used to support schools, what will or will not be taught, the length of the school day and school year, how many years of compulsory education will be required, and whether or not the state will have community colleges slash and or vocational slash technical schools. Legislatures may also make policies that apply to the matters such as pupil attendance, admission, promotion, listen to this, teacher certification, teacher tenure and retirement, and collective bargaining. Now, at the K-12 level, we don't have teacher tenure. That's only at the higher ed level. But listen to that, teacher certification. So there is a committee that comes up with, at the politician level, the legislature level, that determines things like praxis score cutoffs, things of that nature by recommendation, of course, of people who are in education. So don't blame, the local colleges and universities that have these praxis scores and they say, oh, y'all just raised them. No, we didn't do anything. That comes through the legislature. Other policies developed by the state legislature may also apply to non-public schools in the state. Policies related to health service, building, construction, safety, school, lunch services, textbooks, testing for pupils, for example. In general, state legislatures may pass laws that provide for reasonable supervision of non-public educational institutions. Now, turning over to page 192, I want you to look at the very first paragraph that talks about the state courts. From time to time, state courts are called upon to uphold the power of the legislature to develop laws that apply to schools. Now remember, the legislature develops the law, and then the state court determines that the power doesn't conflict with the state constitution or U.S. Constitution. In other words, they interpret the law. It is important to remember, too, that the role of the state court is not to develop laws, but to rule on the reasonableness of the laws to specific educational situations. And it just goes on to talk about one particular case. But we will talk, we'll have a whole chapter on school law in the next chapter. The governor. The governor can choose to be very influential in schools, or they could have hands-off policy. Want you to highlight the first paragraph there. Although the powers vary from state to state, they can be very influential if they choose to be. The governor may appoint and or remove educators at the state level. And in some states, the governor may even appoint the chief state school officer. I believe, I want to say the governor before Governor Bryant. I don't know why I can't remember everybody. Governor Barber. I think he was the one that appointed Hank Bounds to be the IHL commissioner. I don't think when he was made chief, I don't know, he might have appointed him state superintendent too. I have to check on that. Furthermore, in every state except for North Carolina, the governor may use his or her veto power to influence the state legislature to pass certain laws related to education. Okay, so state takeover of schools. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about this on video, but we can talk about this in class because we have one right in our county, LaFleur County, that was taken over. Since the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2001, state takeover is an intervention that can be applied to chronically low achieving schools and districts. So it could be a school that they take over, it could be a whole district. Going on to page 193, the State Board of Education. This is talking about the people that are charged with making the decisions on the day-to-day basis of schools at the state level. The State Board, acting under the authority of the state legislature, is the highest educational agency in the state. I'm reading from the first paragraph. Every state, with the exception of Wisconsin, has the State Board of Education. Most states have two separate boards, one responsible for elementary through secondary, and then one responsible for higher ed. And we have that. We have one that is just responsible for institutions of higher learning. Okay. All right, State Department of Education. Highlight the first paragraph. The educational program of each state is implemented by the state's Department of Education, better known here as MDE. Under the leadership of the chief state school officer. We call ours our state superintendent. State departments of education have a broad set of responsibilities that literally affect every school district teacher education program in the state. So a lot of the rules that we have to enforce related to praxis scores and cutoffs, or the guidelines to be admitted into a teacher education program, comes from this department. In general, the State Board of Education is concerned with policymaking the State Department of Education with the day-to-day implementation of those policies. Okay, so what does the chief state school officer do, or the state superintendent? Well, we have two. We have one that we consider a commissioner of IHL. We have one called the state superintendent. And I'm reading on page 194, the chief state school officer, known as the Commissioner of Education or Superintendent of Public Instruction in many states, is the chief administrator of the State Department of Education and the head of the State Board of Education. So in other words, there's like one superintendent over every school district, and he or she has a board. In this case, it's a she, Dr. Carrie Wright. She has a board. And then you have the institutions of higher learning, that's the board, and then you have a commissioner, Dr. Hank Bounds, who's like the superintendent of all the colleges and universities we have. So that's how it's set up. I'm not going to really talk about these next couple of sections. I'm going to go on to page 199. And all I want you to know is when it talks about funding, how are schools financed in the United States, there is an expenditure per pupil dividend or basically what that is simply, and it doesn't really give you a definition, but basically you need to know that when you divide up all the money that a school district gets, either through the state, through the federal government, once you put it all into one spot and then you divide it up per child, there is an expenditure per pupil, or a certain amount of money that's attached to a child. It could be thousands of dollars. It could be anywhere from eight to nine, $10,000 a child. And it sounds like a lot, but you have to remember that there are so many things that has to be paid for in public education. You have to pay for the furniture that the kids sit in. You have to pay for, remember we talked about that if a school has stairs and you got one child that has some type of physicality, be it wheelchair or something like that, then they can't mobily walk up the stairs, then you have to provide some kind of stair lift, or you have to provide bus transportation for this child if they choose to ride the bus. So all that money has to come from somewhere, and it's divided up per child. Sources of funding on page 200. A combination of revenues from local, state, and federal sources is used to finance public elementary and secondary schools in the U.S. And it goes on page 201. It talks about the little pie graph there, how it's really small from the federal government. Most of it comes from state and then local. Okay, I used the example in Bolivar County. In Bolivar County, if you live in Cleveland, um, and I did live in Cleveland, my property taxes went toward, I paid county taxes for Bolivar County, and I paid city taxes because I lived in the city. So, and part of those city taxes went to Cleveland School District. Local funding. At the local level, most funding on page 201, first paragraph, comes from property taxes, which are determined by the value of property in the school district. Property taxes are assessed against real estate, and in some districts also against personal property such as cars, household furniture, appliances, and stocks and bonds. So if you live in a neighborhood with, all the houses are around 150 to $200,000 or even more, you're probably going to have some really nice schools versus houses being anywhere from 60 to 90,000, and those schools are not going to, because they're not generating as much from the property taxes, so they're not going to look as nice as the ones from the 100 to 150,000 and so on. State funding. Highlight the first paragraph there. Most state revenues for education come in the form of sales tax and income tax. Sales taxes are added to the cost of items such as general goods, gasoline, amusements, alcohol, and insurance. Income taxes are paid on individuals in many states and businesses and industry. So sales tax, I know in Tennessee, goes toward education. They also have a state lottery that helps to fund public education. Federal funding on page 203, just want you to go down to the third paragraph and highlight it, and then highlight the last paragraph, and it talks about something called entitlements. You may have heard of Title I, Title II, Title III, but you never really knew what it was. Well, they're short for the word entitlements, and these are grants that come from the federal government to zone in on certain things. For instance, the most significant entitlement, and I'm reading from the book, is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which President George W. Bush reauthorized as No Child Left Behind in 2001. And then there was a reauthorization again of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that President Obama has done in 2010, called A Blueprint for Reform. So those are some examples of entitlements. Title I of the Act allocates $1 billion annually to school districts with large numbers of students from low-income families. Among other funded entitlement programs is the Vocation Act of 1963, Manpower Development Training of 63, Economic Opportunity Act of 64, the Bilingual Education Act of 68, Indian Education Act of 72, and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. We've talked about a few of these. And finally, the federal government also provides funding for preschool programs such as Project Head Start, originally started under the Economic Opportunity Act of '64 to provide preschool experiences to poor children. Head Start was later made available to children whose parents were above the poverty level.